over the weekend, the Holy Father, Pope Francis, released a new encyclical letter, and I'm going to talk about it today. So we're going to start with a prayer that he has at the end of the letter, so I'm just going to read it. So we're going to begin in the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Lord, Father of our human family, you created all human beings equal in dignity. Pour forth into our hearts a fraternal spirit, and inspire in us a dream of renewed encounter, dialogue, justice, and peace. Move us to create healthier societies and a more dignified world, a world without hunger, poverty, violence, and war. May our hearts be open to all the peoples and nations of the earth. May we recognize the goodness and the beauty that you have sown in each of us, and thus forge bonds of unity, common projects, and shared dreams. Amen. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Great. So, can everyone hear me with the mask and stuff? Cool. All right. So, since the Holy Father has released an encyclical letter, and these documents, he writes them for the Church, I figure most people don't read them. So it might be beneficial to just take a minute to talk about it and what he has to say to the Church, because he's our shepherd and we should maybe at least kind of pay attention. So I'm going to start with, okay, what is an encyclical? What does that word mean? Why do we care? What is this document about? Why did Pope Francis write it? What is he trying to tell us at this time in the history of the world and the Church? We're going to again go through the document. There are 8 chapters. I'm just going to walk through each one. This is sort of unstructured. The document came out 3 days ago, so this isn't like a serious critical analysis of it. I'm just going to hold out some bits that I thought were cool, and we're going to just kind of talk about them. And then we'll conclude with some questions. We're going to maybe do a little more stuff if we have time. This might get long. So I'm going to start with what is an encyclical. So, the word encyclical, you might be able to tell, it sounds like cyclical, like circle. And the reason why is because it comes from the Greek letter that means, or the Greek word that means circular. So, if you came to Father Lisa's talk about Revelation, then this image will look familiar. This is the map of all of the churches that the book of Revelation is sent to as a letter, and its names, each of them are names in it. And you can see that it kind of forms like a circle, and that's kind of rough. The idea behind an encyclical letter is like, back in the early days of the church, they didn't have like the internet. Pope Francis couldn't just hit a button and then at midnight everyone gets his document. They would write the letter and then send it to a church, and then that church would copy it so that they had a copy, and then they would send it on to the next church, and they would send it on to the next church. It's actually really cool. You get these letters where the copy in France has a bunch of signatures at the end of the people that were transcribing it and then sending it on, so you can actually trace the pathway that it took. So that's what an encyclical letter is. Nowadays, it just kind of is meant to be a letter that the Pope is writing to the whole church. So, Pope Francis, this is his 3rd one that he's writing. The Pope writes other stuff, but this is his 3rd encyclical. Pope Benedict XVI wrote 3 encyclicals. Pope John Paul II wrote 14 because he's a machine. And so the interesting thing about encyclicals is they're sort of geared towards all of the bishops. He's mainly addressing the bishops, but frequently, including this letter, the Pope decided to address it to all people of goodwill. So he's not just intentionally talking to the bishops and the leaders in the church, he's crafted this message for the whole world. And so that's why I wanted to take some time to talk about it today. Something to bear in mind is that encyclicals are not doctrine per se, but they do have authoritative teaching power. So I'm not an expert in this, but my understanding is that if someone's trying to tell you that Pope Francis wrote an encyclical and oh my gosh, he changed what the church believes, that's not how they aren't hardcore law. But popes do use encyclicals as part of their normal, ordinary teaching authority. So if the Pope says something in an encyclical, we really need to he is guided by the Holy Spirit, and this is important for us. And so if he's addressing a topic which the church doesn't have a prior statements on, then we can kind of take it as, like, this is binding, but that's not very typical. So just bear that in mind, because you see things. So, why did Pope Francis write this letter? Why, at this time in the Church's history, has he decided to write this letter? Well, I think there's a couple reasons. Pope Francis actually writes and talks a lot. Like, he goes all over the world, and he talks to people, and he, holds synods, and he writes things, and I think we don't realize that, because, like, every once in a while we'll see, like, a hot take about him in the news, but we don't normally hear, like, the things that he's actually saying to people. So, Pope Francis has a really interesting writing style. He quotes a lot. Like, this document is 287 paragraphs, they're numbered, and he has 288 citations in the whole document. So he quotes something about once a paragraph. And most of those quotations are from himself. Most of them are things that he said or wrote elsewhere, and he's just stringing them all together. And I think the reason why he's doing that is because he wants people to know. Like, he's written and he's said a lot of things, and he just wants to bundle that up into a way where, if we weren't watching his, like, address to young people in Macedonia, then we can still, like, know what he said, because he thinks that it was worth saying, and most people didn't see that. So, I think that's kind of why he wrote this. What's it about? Well, when I Googled the name of this encyclical on Sunday, this is the first thing that came up. Oh, you might have heard of this gentleman. Breaking, Pope Francis closes the door on the death penalty. Wow, okay, good to know. He wrote 287 paragraphs to get that headline. Great. What else did he say? Oh, he's saying capitalism is bad. Great. Yeah, he does briefly mention Martin Luther King Jr. I'm not sure why the church militant thought that was a bad thing, but okay. My point is, like, people frequently politicize the Pope, and I think, I don't know, like, for me, like, before I started paying attention to what he was actually saying, like, that's all I ever heard about him, was that he's, like, some kind of liberal, said with the most disgust in, their voice. Like, people always try to, sift through what he writes and what he says and pull out these hot takes and try to make it all. I think that's really disingenuous. Like, I think we're not doing the Pope justice if, like, we dissect something that he read and we just pull one thing out of it. My favorite, actually, wait, there's more. Yeah, people were mad about the title. The title Fratelli, Tutti means all brothers, and so he's looking at this. My favorite one, though, is this next one, which is actually about his previous long work that he wrote, which I have right here. It's called Christus Vivit. It's a post-synodal apostolic exhortation. It's not encyclical. It's not important, but Pope Francis said the Catholic Church should support women's rights. Glad he clarified that. I wasn't sure, I saw that and I just, like, laughed. Like, oh, glad the Pope finally is telling us we should support women's rights. Like, I want you guys to know, like, I brought this so that I could show you, this is a book. Like, this is about the same length as the thing that he wrote over the weekend. It's like, Pope Francis wrote a book. He didn't just say, we should support women's rights. He said a lot of things, and if we're just finding the one paragraph where he mentions women's rights, then we're like, because it is one paragraph, like, we're not doing Pope justice. So I want to go through this document, and I want to actually pay attention to what the Pope is saying and what he's trying to communicate to us. So what's the encyclical really about? I'm going to let me tell you with our first clip. A lot of this is just going to be me reading quotes to you. So this is from the very beginning, and he's talking about St. Francis of Assisi. He signed this on the feast day of St. Francis of Assisi, and he really likes to reflect on St. Francis because that's so. St. Francis did not wage a war of words aimed at opposing doctrines. He simply spread the love of God. He understood that God is love, and those who abide in love abide in God. In this way, he became a father to all and inspired a vision of fraternal society. Indeed, only the man who approaches others, not to draw them into his own life, but to help them become ever more holy themselves, can truly be called a father. In the world at that time, St. Francis of Assisi's time, the Middle Ages, bristling with watchtowers and defensive walls, Cities were a theater of brutal wars between powerful families, even as poverty was spreading through the countryside. Yet there Francis was able to welcome true peace into his heart and free himself of the desire to wield power over others. He became one of the poor and sought to live in harmony with all. Francis has inspired these pages. So, something I'd like to point out right off the bat is Pope Francis, several times in this document, draws kind of a parallel St. Francis's, the time that he was living in, and the culture that he was living in, and our culture today. And he does this sort of implicitly. But I think it's significant that he mentions cities, watchtowers, defensive walls, conflicts, struggles, poverty is spreading at the expense of, or poverty is spreading and there's few that are collecting wealth. He's not explicitly saying that that's what he thinks the world today is yet, but there's definitely like the sense of this is what the world was like when St. Francis was alive, and how did St. Francis deal with it? St. Francis didn't argue with people, he didn't try to tell people that they were wrong, but he was a servant for others. He gave up everything that he had in order to show people what Christianity is about, and that was the solution. That was how he rebuilt the church. So that's what the Holy Father is calling us to do today. The following pages do not claim to offer a complete teaching on fraternal love, but rather to consider its universal scope, its openness to every man and woman. I offer this social encyclical as a modest contribution to continued reflection, and hope that in the face of present-day attempts to eliminate or ignore others, we may prove capable of responding with a new vision of fraternity and social friendship that will not remain at the level of words. Although I have written it from the Christian convictions that inspire and sustain me, I have sought to make this reflection an invitation to dialogue among all people with goodwill. I'll read that again. My favorite thing about encyclicals is they always have dramatic chapter titles. So the first chapter is called Dark Clouds Over a Closed World. The Holy Father begins the letter by enumerating a lot of the issues that we have in our society. And I think what's significant about this is not just that he is talking about socio-political issues because he does that, but he really gets right to what's happening in the human heart in modern man. For decades, it seems that the world had learned a lesson from its many wars and disasters, and was slowly moving towards various forms of integration. Our own days, however, seem to be showing signs of certain regression. Ancient conflicts thought long buried are breaking out anew, while instances of myopic, extremist, resentful, and aggressive nationalism are on the rise. Goodness, together with love, justice, and solidarity, are not achieved once and for all, but have to be realized each day. It is not possible to settle for what was achieved in the past and complacently enjoy it, as if we can sometimes disregard the fact that many of our brothers and sisters still endure situations that cry out for our attention. So he's referring to like the post-World War II, like, wow, that was really bad, let's never have a war again kind of mindset. That's not how humans work. We have original sin, we have concupiscence, and he's trying to say that peace is something that we really have to work at. And that's one of the major themes of the letter, is that we can't just sit back and say that we did. We have justice now. But we also can't just like scrap the whole thing. That's important too. What we achieved in the past is real. So he continues, as a result, there is a growing loss of the sense of history, which leads to even further breakup. A kind of deconstructionism, where human freedom claims to create everything starting from zero, is making headway in today's culture. The one thing it leaves in its wake is the drive to limitless consumption and expressions of empty individualism. So you can see here why I got so excited about this, because like he's looking at the world and he's seeing what we see. He's seeing that people are becoming so consumed with themselves. Like, what are some examples of this deconstructionism that he's talking about, where we think we need to start everything from square zero? We have to do everything ourselves. You know, like, this is our mindset when it comes to politics. This is our mindset when it comes to religion. Like, people think, I'm the only one that I can trust. I have to figure this all out myself. And it's depressing. And that's what Pope Francis is seeing in the world. Like, it's not just, you know, our vision is weird. Like, he's identifying that this is how humans are feeling in the 21st century. And he wants to do something about it. He wants to address it. resources, we have a tendency to isolate ourselves. In today's world, the sense of belonging to a single human family is fading. The dream of working together for justice and peace seems to not be a utopia. What reigns instead is a cool, comfortable, globalized indifference, born of a deep disillusionment, sealed under a deceptive illusion, thinking we are all powerful, but failing to realize that we are all in the same boat. All I need is my Netflix subscription, I can order things on Amazon, and I've got that Whole Foods thing that will deliver it to my door. That's all I need. I don't need anyone else. I don't need anything else. This is a real thing that we're seeing. So, what I got out of this was what I think is like the first real major theme of this letter, is that the Holy Father is subverting the modernist project. The idea behind modernism, the idea behind like a lot of the philosophy that was coming out of the first part of the 20th century, is like, okay, well, history is on this journey, it's on this arc, right? Like, things are getting better. We have democracy now. We figured that out. We're getting rid of racism. Well, this is great. History is just going to keep marching forward, and I'm maybe just a little cog in it, but eventually it's going to get there. Things are just going to keep getting better. One day, it's going to be the 24th century, and we're going to have starships, and it's going to be awesome. This is the idea of modernism. And what Pope Francis says, and I think I have it here, what he's saying is like, hey, it's 2020, and that didn't happen. We had all this progress, we thought that we were doing so good, and it didn't work. The idea of modernism failed, and that's especially shown by things like, we talk about throwaway culture. We talk about things like racism and abortion and disdain for the elderly. And he says that those things continue to shame us, for they show that our supposed social progress is not as real or definitive as we think. If we think that we're making progress, we might be deluding ourselves. Now, this isn't supposed to be, one, it's not supposed to be depressing, and two, it's not supposed to be rooted in ideology. He's not saying, oh, those liberals, they were doing such a good job, they thought they were, but really it's conservative values, that's what we need. That's not what he's saying. And he's also not saying we might as well just give up the whole thing. What he's saying is that we can't rely on ourselves, because we're fallen humans. We have original sin, we have concupiscence, and he uses that word explicitly later. We're always going to kind of screw things up if we think that we can fall into this digital society, if we think that consumerism is going to save us. He uses the term profit-based economic models, and we'll talk more about later what that means, but like, if we continue to rely, an example that he gives is like, we had this 2008 financial crisis, and when it kind of exploded, we thought, oh, we'll just keep doing the same thing, but bigger, and then it'll work this time. COVID, he actually says, I wish I would have put it up there, I think I did. He says something about this, global pandemic. If we think that the solution to the global pandemic is to fix it and then just keep doing things the way that we were doing but more, then we're fooling ourselves. If we think that that's going to make things better next time a global disaster happens. If we think that we're going to be closer together as a result of the ways that we continue to isolate ourselves with technology. So, I'm probably getting there at this. By closely observing our contemporary societies, we see numerous contradictions that lead us to wonder whether the equal dignity of all human beings, solemnly proclaimed 70 years ago with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights that the United Nations issued like 5 years after it was founded, solemnly proclaimed 70 years ago, is truly recognized, respected, protected, and promoted in every situation. Injustice persists, fed by reductive anthropological visions by a profit-based economic model that does not hesitate to exploit, discard, or even kill human beings. While one part of humanity lives in opulence, another part sees its own dignity denied, scorned, trampled upon, and its fundamental rights discarded or violated. The phrase reductive anthropological vision means the human is only material. The spirituality thing isn't real. We are not looking at the whole human person, spiritual and physical, and as a result, people are unhappy. We don't understand how people work, and so we can't care for the person. Another quote on that: isolation and withdrawal to one's own interests are never the way to restore hope and bring about renewal. Rather, it is closeness. It is the culture of encounter. Isolation, no. Closeness, yes. Culture clash, no. Culture of encounter, yes. Yeah, so, chapter 2. Stranger on the road. I forgot to bring my Bible back. Would you happen to have one with us? Thank you. Something that I also love about encyclicals is that the popes tend to just take a biblical passage and do exegesis on it as part of the text of their encyclical. And the Holy Father does this, and it's really great. So I'm going to read you the passage that he uses now. And behold, a lawyer stood up, and to put him to the test, saying, Teacher, what shall I do to inherit eternal life? Jesus said to him, What is written in the law? How do you read it? And he answered, You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your strength, and with all your mind, and your neighbor as yourself. And he said to him, You have answered right. Do this, and you will live. But he, the lawyer, desiring to justify himself, said to Jesus, And who is my neighbor? So Jesus replied, A man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho, and he fell among robbers, who stripped him and beat him and departed, leaving him half dead. Now by chance a priest was going down that road, and when he saw him, he passed by on the other side. So likewise a Levite, a member of the priestly class, when he came to the place and saw him, passed by on the other side. But a Samaritan, as he journeyed, came to where he was, and when he saw him, he had compassion, and went to him and bound up his wounds, pouring on oil and wine. Then he set him on his own beast and brought him to an inn to care of him. And the next day he took 2 denarii and gave them to the innkeeper, saying, Take care of him, and whatever more you spend, I will repay you when I come back. Which of these 3 do you think proved neighbor to the man who fell among the robbers? He said, The one who showed mercy. And Jesus said to him, Go and do likewise. So, the Holy Father has his introduction where he talks about a lot of problems in the world, and then he jumps into this parable because it is the answer. What is the moral of the story, the parable of the Good Samaritan? If you had to just give me the log line, what's the moral of the story? Anyone? Father, please.
When your neighbor is someone you think you can expect them to be.
Yes.
Your neighbor is bigger than this, more than what you thought it was.
Yes. Who is your neighbor? Your neighbor is anything. Your neighbor is everything. So, as the Second Vatican Council put it, the joys and hopes, the grief and anguish of the people of our time, especially of those who are poor or afflicted, but the joys and hopes, the grief and anguish of the followers of Christ as well. Nothing that is genuinely human fails to find an echo in their hearts. This is really the big thing of the Second Vatican Council. If we are Christians, if we are united with Jesus, Jesus hurts when we hurt. The Lord feels our pain. And we're called to do the same thing. If we have hearts that are united to His, then we'll bleed with them. So I put this up here because Pope Francis quotes it in his document. He says that we have to acknowledge our continual failures to address evil in the world. And he spends a lot of time reflecting on how we can do this in our own hearts. Because institutional solutions are one thing, but this parable was meant for us as individuals. We're meant to ask ourselves, which of these persons do you identify with? Are you the robbers? Are you the priests that pass by and don't pay attention? Are you the victim? Are you the man who was beat and thrown in the ditch? Are you the innkeeper who doesn't know about the situation, but when it's brought to his attention, he enters into it and helps? This question, blunt as it is direct and decisive. Which of these characters do you resemble? We need to acknowledge that we are constantly tempted to ignore others, especially the weak. Let us admit that, for all the progress we have made, we are still illiterate when it comes to accompanying, caring for, and supporting the most frail and vulnerable members of our adult societies. We've become accustomed to looking the other way, passing by, ignoring situations until they affect us directly. This is not what Christ desires for us. But this is what we do as a society, and I think we find this in our own hearts if we're critical. So, this is the second major theme that I pulled out of this document, which is really a theme of Pope Francis' pontificate. We are made for encounter. We're not made to ignore people. We're not made to pretend that suffering doesn't exist until it affects us. We're made to encounter Christ incarnately present in the poor. We're made to encounter the people around us, the beautiful human beings that God has made. And our artificial consumer-driven world can never satisfy that. In meeting someone on the internet, it's cool. I have gay friends that I met on the internet, and it's kind of cool. We still talk to each other, but it's not the same as meeting someone in person. And Holy Father has some really great lines about that. This parable clearly does not indulge in abstract moralizing, nor is its message merely social and ethical. It speaks to us of an essential and often forgotten aspect of our common humanity. We are created for a fulfillment that can only be found in love. We cannot be indifferent to suffering. We cannot allow anyone to go through life as an outcast. Instead, we should feel indignant, challenged to emerge from our comfortable isolation and to be changed by our contact with human suffering. That is the meaning of dignity. About this time last year, I went to visit Elizabeth, my fiance, in Denver, where she was doing a year of mission serving before. When I returned to Little Rock, Arkansas, which is where I lived at the time, I took an Uber back from the airport to my house. And I really liked having a girlfriend that was doing a year of mission work because it was a great fuel for conversations. So I'm talking to this younger driver, and he was like, what are you doing? Oh, I was in Denver, or I was in Denver visiting my girlfriend. Oh, what does she do there? She's a missionary. She serves the homeless. So we were talking about this. And this guy was a Christian. They had a lot of Baptists in Arkansas. And it became clear to me over the course of the conversation that he didn't really think very much. He didn't really think very highly of what I was doing, serving the poor in Denver. And the reason why is because I was like, Jesus, he said, whatever you do to the least of my brothers, you do to me. And this guy was like, he was talking about other Christians, other believers. And I was like, geez, I know this guy's wrong, but I'm not exactly sure how to tell him that, from back in 25. I guess he just says my brothers. It's kind of vague. What I should have told him was I should have pointed him to this passage, the Good Samaritan. Because Jesus is very clear. We have a fundamental desire to encounter God, and we do that in the people around us. Something that's really important about the Good Samaritan is y'all know what Samaritans were? Samaritans weren't just another country. It was Israel was God's chosen people, and the kingdom split because of political reasons, and the northern half was not faithful to the covenant. They intermingled bloodline-wise with the pagans. They adopted pagan customs and kind of mixed the Jewish religion with pagan customs. So when a Samaritan wandered by a Jewish town, they were not friendly with one another. It was like just being kind to a Samaritan was seen as bad news. You're not a real Jew if you're doing that. So the fact that Jesus uses a Samaritan to illustrate this, he's really saying, that guy you think, well, I can be nice to everyone but not him, or people in the world that you don't want to look at, you want to pretend they don't exist. Those are the people that are our brothers. Those are the people that if we give them kindness, we're giving it to Christ. He's very, very, very good. There's a certain interplay. Okay, so here's where it starts to get a little more down. There is a certain interplay between those who manipulate and cheat society and those who, while claiming to be detached and impartial critics, live off that system and its benefits. There is a sad hypocrisy when the impunity of crime, the use of institutions for personal or corporate gain, and other evils apparently impossible to eradicate are accompanied by a restless criticism of everything. A constant sowing of suspicion that results in distrust and confusion. The complaint that everything's broken is answered by the claim that it can't be fixed. What can I do? This feeds into disillusionment and despair, and hardly encourages a spirit of solidarity and generosity. How often do we hear this? How often do we do this? Everything sucks. The government, whatever, I've given up. I have given up a little bit, I'm serious. But the Holy Father is exhorting us. We're kind of hypocrites if we sit around and we complain about the government and our consumerist society, but I ordered Chipotle recently, I have the Postmates app on my phone, I ordered something off of Amazon for Ellie's birthday, we partake in these structures that we so often complain about. the Holy Father is exhorting us that if it's true that in the poor we see the flesh of Christ, and we see our own flesh, we cannot be indifferent. We can't sit around and complain about how terrible society is if we're feeding into it just as much as anyone else. So this encounter of mercy between a Samaritan and a Jew is highly for ideological manipulation and challenges us to expand our frontiers. It grants a universal dimension to our call to love, one that transcends all prejudices, all historical and cultural barriers, all petty interests. So, he's going to now tell us how he thinks this principle can be applied to the world at large. We're being called to solidarity in our individual lives. How are we called to solidarity institutionally? So this is what I think the third main theme of this work is. Love must ever seek to be more open. If everyone is our neighbor, if everyone is called to be our neighbor, then we always have to be open to expanding that definition. And we can never try to exclude people. So he starts by naming groups that he calls existential foreigners. Every brother or sister in need, when abandoned or ignored by the society in which they live, becomes an existential foreigner, even though born in the same country. You may be citizens with full rights if they are treated like foreigners in their own country. He's really serious about the elderly. He talks a lot about the elderly and how disenfranchised they are, how we shuffle them off, how lonely they are. Also, people with physical disabilities, people with mental disabilities. His point is that even though I guess you could even lump like prisoners of felons in this category, like people who, even though they are citizens of any given country, they really aren't enfranchised. They aren't treated as human beings in the way that they should be. They aren't given their proper dignity. So then he seeks to explain that the whole world is connected. And this is even more true now than it ever was before. Nothing that happens in our country or in our society is isolated. Everything affects the whole world. We need to develop the awareness that nowadays we are all either safe, or we are either all safe together, or no one is safe. Poverty, decadence, and suffering in one part of the earth are a silent breeding ground for problems that will end up affecting the entire planet. If we are troubled by the extinction of certain species, we should be all the more troubled that in some parts of our world, individuals' peoples are prevented from developing their potential and beauty by poverty or other structural limitations. In the end, this will impoverish us all. It matters what's going on in the world. It matters for us what's going on in the world. It matters for our society. And this isn't a politically motivated idea. He's taking this principle of everyone is our neighbor and he's expanding it. He's following it to its next level, so. So, I'm certainly not proposing an authoritarian and abstract universalism devised or planned by a small group who presents it as an ideal for the sake of leveling, dominating, and hungering. One model of globalization, in fact, consciously aims at a one-dimensional uniformity and seeks to eliminate all differences and traditions in a superficial press community. If a certain kind of globalization claims to make everyone uniform, to level everyone out, that globalization destroys the richness and uniqueness of each person and each people. He's talking about collectivism. He's talking about this idea that we need to make everyone equal. We can give everyone rights as long as everyone is kind of the same. And I think the Holy Father is often accused of that kind of thing. He's often accused of being a socialist or a communist or something like that. And behind those accusations is, those aren't necessarily economic accusations. It's he's a collectivist. He wants to take away our identity. Those are the problems with those philosophies. He's very explicitly saying, that's not what I'm doing here. This is something that I thought I'd throw in here because he's about to start talking about some very specific issues in the world. And I think this is something that we often forget as Americans. The Holy Father is not just talking to us about us. How often does the Holy Father say something like, we need to tear down walls instead of build them? And people go, wow, he's talking directly to Donald Trump, or that kind of thing. Newsflash, he's not. The world is bigger than just America. The church is bigger than just America. Like, the Holy Father has a view of the world landscape, the global political and social landscape, and also like the spirituality of the world that none of us have, and probably none of us will have. You know, like unless we become the president or something. Like, we need to bear this in mind when we're reading the president, that or when we're reading the Pope, that he is talking about issues that are operating on a larger scale. He's not interested in what political party you vote for necessarily, right? I wanted to point that out. I think that's really important, and we really tend to forget that. So we got to take him seriously when he says things like, if every human being possesses an inalienable dignity, if all people are my brothers and sisters, and if the world truly belongs to everyone, then it matters little whether my neighbor was born in my country or elsewhere. He also shares responsibility for his or her development. I think as Americans, we read something like that, and we're like, he is talking about the ongoing debate about illegal immigration in the United States. Maybe. But this is also just true, you know? Like, he's not just pulling this out because he's trying to comment on any particular political situation. He's, again, extrapolating from the principle that everyone is our neighbor, that means we should treat people with dignity no matter who they are, or where they come from. No one then can remain excluded because of his or her place of birth, much less because of privileges enjoyed by others who were born in lands greater opportunity. The limits and borders of individual states cannot stand in the way of this. As it is unacceptable that some have pure rights by virtue of being women, it is likewise unacceptable that the mere place of one's birth or residence should result in his or her possessing fewer opportunities for a developed or dignified life. I think this is really important because we read this, and that's why we get church militant headlines about how much of a liberal Pope Francis is. Because he speaks directly into the fact that we're so ideologically driven and divisive today that we can't read past the surface rhetoric of what's going on. But this is serious business. We need to really pay attention to this and take it into account when we are making our political decisions. Because this is a more universal truth than just what we're doing in our country, but it does impact how we vote and that kind of thing. I felt actually maybe I shouldn't have done this. Maybe this is too much of a hot take, but this is a quote from the Republican official party platform. America's immigration policy must serve the national interests of the United States, and the interests of American workers must be protected over the claims of foreign nationals seeking the same jobs. That's what the Republican Party says. I'm not saying that means you're a bad person if you're a Republican or something. It doesn't register as a Republican, but I mean that's what the Republican Party says. The Holy Bible says, "When a stranger resides with you in your land, you shall not do him wrong. The stranger who resides with you shall be to you as a citizen among you. You shall love the stranger as yourself, for you are once strangers in the land of Egypt." So I'm going to get off my immigration high horse now, but I don't know. This was just a section that spoke to me, and it spoke to a lot of what I've been thinking about recently with the political situation. So, chapter 3. I don't know if we're going to get through all of this. Love must ever cease to be more open. Didn't I just talk about this? Chapter 4. We're on chapter 4. Sorry. Okay. This is where, if you were worried, it starts to sound more like a concern. Ideally, unnecessary migration ought to be avoided. This entails creating in the countries of origin the conditions needed for a dignified life and integral development. So he's not just talking about particular governments, he's talking about human flourishing. He's talking about, like, what can we all have in mind as a goal to make lives better. Until substantial progress is made in achieving this goal, we are obliged to respect the right of all individuals to find a place that meets the basic needs of those of their families. Our response to the arrival of migrating persons can be summarized by 4 words: welcome, protect, promote, and integrate. For it is not the case of implementing welfare programs from the top down. That's scientific, but rather of undertaking a journey together through these 4 actions in order to build cities and countries that, while preserving their respective cultural and religious identity, are open to differences and know how to promote them in the spirit of human fraternity. He's moving into this section about like what it means to love. Like, it doesn't matter if the president says no people from other countries can come to America. It doesn't matter if it says anyone from another country can come to America. It doesn't matter, because what matters is how we treat people that we encounter that are different from ourselves. And he's giving us specific actions. He's actually quoting himself there, from something he wrote earlier. But he's giving us like specific actions that we should take when we encounter people that are different from ourselves, how we should welcome them. He says that we need to be gratuitous, because God is gratuitous. Gratuitousness is the ability to do something simply because they are good in themselves, without concern for personal gain or recompense. Gratuitousness makes it possible for us to welcome a stranger, even though this brings us no immediate tangible benefit. God gave us life. He gave us so many gifts. We give him nothing. He got nothing out of it. If we're called to be like Christ, we're called to be gratuitous with our love. We're called to love even the people that it hurts us to love. Even if it's inconvenient, or even if we do have to deal with actual repercussions, we're called to love gratuitously, because that's what Christ did. Okay. We're down to that. Chapter 5. He starts talking about political theory, and this is a really interesting document because sometimes people would use the Holy Father of being kind of imprecise and saying things that they're like, I don't know, what did he mean? This document is not like that. He's straightforward, and he starts talking about some serious political theory here. His main theme of this section is extreme ideologies always thrive at the expense of the poor. Extreme ideologies are never good for the poor. So he loves to have this strategic, which has been around for a little while. And he says the biggest issue is employment. The truly popular thing. Okay, I got this in a weird order. He's making reference to the use of the word populism. The truly popular thing, since it promotes the good of the people, is to provide everyone with the opportunity to nurture the seeds that God has planted in each of us. Our talents, our initiative, our innate resources. This is the finest help that we can give to the poor, and the best path to a life of dignity. Hence my insistence that helping the poor financially must always be a provisional solution in facing pressing needs. The broader objective should always be to allow them to live a dignified life through work. Work is dignifying. The solution to poverty is not the socialist welfare programs. That's not what he wants, He wants people to have individual dignity. Allowing people to work is a really big part of that. He said something about left ideologies here, and they're not good. I just thought that was helpful again if you were scared. He makes some great points. I had to cut so much. You should really, I want to encourage you at this point actually, read the document yourself. And if you're somewhat interested in some of the things I'm saying, maybe skim it, find a section that interests you. But there's so much that I'm skipping over that was super solid. I was highlighting the entire thing. Anyway, his point with this section is leftists, or red and blue, left and right, these liberal and conservative ideologies, when they're taken to their most extreme, they end up kind of looking like the same thing. Whether it's laissez-faire capitalism, where anything kind of goes and businesses can do whatever they want, or it's all the power being concentrated in the government and providing, wages and food and stuff to everyone, what you end up with is a small group of people who have power, who are exercising that power, generously or not, whatever, but they're exercising that power over the rest of the world, which ultimately makes them disenfranchised. And that's not cool, that's not what love of neighbor looks like. And so that's what I mean when I say extreme ideologies always thrive at the expense of the poor. Both of those ideas are born out of radical individualism. Either I should be able to do what I want in business, or I should be able to do what I want outside of business in the government. I don't have to care about business because the government will give me whatever I want. Either way, it's motivated by a selfish individualism that ultimately leaves us unfulfilled. And it's spiraling down these paths is what's left us in the society that we have now. And the solution is to authentically care about other people. I like this quote. It's from between service is never I like this one too. He says that politics too must make room for a tender love of others. What is tenderness? It is love that draws near and becomes real. A movement that starts from our heart and reaches the eyes, the ears, and the hands. In politics, tenderness in politics. Like, how do we do that? We don't even know what that looks like in our society because of how divisive it is. But if we're really called to love our neighbor as ourselves, then that's what we're called to. It's pretty extreme. Okay, chapter 6 is about dialogue. We've got problems, he's proposing solutions. Approaching, speaking, listening, looking at, coming to know, and understand one another, to find a common ground. All these things are summed up in one word, dialogue. If we want to encounter and help one another, we have to dialogue. There is no need for me to stress the benefits of dialogue. I have only to think what our world would be like without the patient dialogue, the many generous persons who keep families and communities together. Unlike disagreement and conflict, persistent and courageous dialogue does not make headlines, but quietly helps the world to live much better than we imagine. So he's calling for authentic dialogue because he draws people together. And he addresses a really interesting question, which is like, when you talk to people, you might disagree with them. And so it's scary to talk to people. And also, like, if we talk to people and we're hearing them out, but we know they're wrong, are we like humoring them? Like, is it kind of a relativist thing to listen and give people the time of day if they're, that they're wrong? So the major theme of this section is openness to love means openness to encounter. We're willing to love people, we're willing to sit down with them, we're willing to hear them out. Because that's how we love them. You can't love someone unless you know them. And so you encounter them. The culture of encounter, the purpose of that is to draw people closer together, and knit us closer together in authentic relationships so that we're able to love people well. Okay. The solution is not relativism. Under the guise of tolerance, relativism ultimately leaves the interpretation of moral values to those in power, to be defined as they see fit. If society is to have a future, it must respect the truth of our human dignity and submit to that truth. Murder is not wrong simply because it is socially unacceptable and punished by law, but because of a deeper conviction. Otherwise, is it not conceivable that those fundamental human rights which we now consider unassailable will be denied by those in power once they have gained consensus of the apathetic or intimidated population? I think we can think of some examples of times when terrible things were sanctioned because they were popular. So we know that, again, like if you were worried about the Pope being a relativist, the Pope is not a relativist. The Pope knows that fundamental truth is really important. And though it might seem on the surface that like you're opening yourself up to relativism by hearing people out when you disagree with them, it's actually the opposite. Have you ever had a conversation with like a coworker or someone and they express an opinion, or you express an opinion, and it's like a little bit, there's like a moment of like, oh, I don't know what's going to happen. You're like, yeah, I'm interested. Or like, yeah, I think that, abortion is wrong, or something like that. And they're just like, yeah, okay. Or even worse, even better, actually. They're like, okay, well, that's your truth, You do you. But I'm trying to get it, and then they turn away, and the conversation ends, and you're like, dang, I really wanted to proclaim the gospel with zeal, but they're not interested in talking to me. Because the fact is, relativism stifles dialogue. Relativism is to say to someone, yeah, well, that's just what I think, and that's just what you think, and that's what it is. I mean, I'm sure you've had that happen to you before, and that's end of conversation. You can't get over that hump, Like, if we want to have dialogue, we need to be open to hearing each other. We can't, so that's the point. It's not relativism. The fact that certain rules are indispensable to the very life of society is a sign that they are good in and of themselves. There is no need then to oppose the interests of society, consensus, and the reality of their truth. These three realities can be harmonized whenever, through dialogue, people are unafraid to get to the heart of an issue. So, if we're having authentic dialogue, like if we're really care about truth and we're really trying to get at it and we're really trying to figure other people out, dialogue is going to find that need. Like if we're not yelling at each other, but instead we're standing side by side pursuing a common goal, like we're much more likely to get there. So, the short and long of it is dialogue is like it's one of those solutions to this problem of our divisive society. I include this picture because this is Grand Imam Ahmad al-Tayyib, the Pope of Islam, I guess. Pope Francis makes reference several times, a whole bunch of times throughout this letter, to a conversation, or maybe a series of conversations that he had with the Grand Imam of Egypt. And they had a sincere dialogue, and at the end of it, they published the documents with joint resolutions that they had agreed upon. We want to make no mistake, Islam and Christianity are very different, despite what people sometimes say. But the fact is, when we're talking about human fraternity, when we're talking about peace in the world, like, we can coexist with people as different from us as Muslims. And I think the Holy Father is a great example of that. He had a sincere dialogue with this man. He has what appears to be a sincere friendship with him based on how fondly he talks about that conversation in this letter. He's putting into action what he's telling us to do. And the world is better off for it because it inspired this letter. Okay. In a political world right now, we've forgotten this. And you've seen the nastiness that it fosters. St. Paul describes kindness as a fruit of the Holy Spirit. Individuals who possess this quality help make other people's lives more bearable, especially problems, needs, and fears. This way of treating others, this is kindness, this way of treating others can take different forms. An act of kindness, a concern not to offend by word or deed, a readiness to alleviate the burdens. It involves speaking words of comfort, strength, consolation, and encouragement, and not words of demean, sadden, anger, or show scorn. You know, sometimes when I talk to people, I tend to be very I qualify things. I want to make sure you know that I'm not trying to offend you. I want to be nice. And sometimes you don't need to be nice. Sometimes you shouldn't be nice. But being nice goes a long way. It's a fruit of the Holy Spirit. You can't just be mean to people and say, yeah, well, I was right. That's not what the Spirit wants us to do. That's not what the Spirit moves us to do. Okay. Is this all kind of making sense? Is this kind of coherent? We're getting there. Chapter 7. This is the chapter that inspires the headlines. And I love when popes do this. They'll spend a lot of time talking about a lot of different great principles, and they're drawing from Scripture, and they're talking about the life of the believer in the church. And then at the end, we'll just kind of extrapolate these other, more specific applications of what they're talking about, and those are always the hot takes. So I'm gonna go through the hot takes. So this is one that's very relevant to recent events in America. There were several things in here that I was like, he definitely was writing this long before, he was crafting this document long before, certain things in America happened. But it's very insightful, some of the things that he points out. So anyway, violent public demonstrations on one side or the other do not help in finding solutions. We've had some violent public demonstrations actually kind of nearby here recently. He says that they're not helpful mainly because, as the bishops of Columbia have identified, the origins and objectives of civil demonstrations are not always clear. Certain forms of political manipulation are present, and in some cases they've been exploited for partisan interests. Does that kind of make sense? If we're violent in the way that we demonstrate, then people on both sides are going to say, well, they're violent, so they're bad, and people on this side are going to say, well, the violent people, they're not what we want, or you know what I mean? There's a lot of shellgame that happens. And it's really interesting because, he's not saying violent protests are wrong because violence is wrong, because that doesn't convince people. He's saying violent protests are ineffective. So I thought that was interesting. Forgiveness. We are called to love everyone without exception. At the same time, loving an oppressor does not mean allowing him to be precedence, or letting him think of what he does is acceptable. On the contrary, true love for an oppressor means seeking ways to make him cease his oppression. If a criminal has harmed me, or a loved one, no one can forbid me from demanding justice and ensuring that this person or anyone else will not harm me or others again. This is entirely just. Forgiveness does not forbid it, it actually demands it. A thought this was really great, because this is something that is like a really tough question. It's like, Jesus really wants to love everyone? But what about that guy? He did that thing to me, and I haven't forgiven him. Like, forgiveness does not mean letting people off the hook. And he actually talks about this quite a bit, sort of, running over it a little bit. But if this is something that you struggle with, or that you want to reflect on, like wrath and unforgiveness, go read this section, because he gives like really good reflections and practical stuff on what forgiveness is and what it means, both as an individual and also as a society, which brings us to the Shoah, Holocaust, must not be forgotten. It is the enduring symbol of the depths to which human people can sink when, spurred by false ideologies, it fails to recognize the fundamental dignity of each person, which merits unconditional respect, regardless of ethnic origin or religious beliefs. Nor must we forget the atomic bombs dropped at Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Neither must we forget the persecutions, the slave trade, and the ethnic killings that continue in various countries, as well as the many other historical events that make us ashamed of our humanity. It needs to be remembered, always, ever, and do. We must never grow passive or ignorant. So I hope I've convinced you at this point that Pope's not just like peddling some like leftist rhetoric. Like, this is actually very much in the tradition of the church. Like, we need to remember bad things that have happened in the world, and if we bear some responsibility in our national identity, we have to acknowledge that. Because of two reasons, kind of. We need to be able to show love to the legitimate victims of those acts of terror, or whatever they might be, and we can't show love to people if we pretend that it never happened. And second, people need to be able to forgive. And you can't forgive someone if you pretend as though what they did to you never happened. So in order to have mutual reconciliation, in order to have true peace in the world, we can't pretend that these things didn't happen or try to downplay them for that kind of thing. Again, we also can't, I guess I'll throw this, and he doesn't say this, but we also can't use them for political gain or to pursue political gain. So I'll throw that out there too, but yeah. Okay, war. In recent decades, every single war has been ostensibly justified. And so what he's saying is like, in recent decades, people have always been very careful, every nation has been very careful if they're going to war to say, oh, but we're doing it for this reason, so it's okay. The Catechism of the Catholic Church speaks of the possibility of legitimate defense by using military force, which involves demonstrating that certain rigorous conditions of moral legitimacy have been met. We can no longer think of war as a solution because its risks will probably always be greater than its supposed benefits. In view of this, it is very difficult nowadays to invoke the rational criteria elaborated in earlier centuries to speak of the possibility of just war. So in earlier centuries, the churches said, well, war is okay sometimes because there are legitimate reasons for defense and there are legitimate ways of getting retributive justice. And again, there's a longer section about this that I would encourage you to read if you're interested in this. Nowadays, if people go to war, if two powerful nations go to war, the entire world suffers in a way that just wasn't true at any other point in human history. And so it's pretty much impossible nowadays to justify war on that scale. For that reason, he says that just war kind of doesn't exist anymore. And by the way, he's very careful to justify this. This isn't just his idea. He cites going back to at least like the creation of nuclear weapons. The church has never been on board with this. The Second Vatican Council is pretty clear about it. Pope John the 23rd was pretty clear about it. Like, in our modern day and age, probably since the First World War, really, war is just like so destructive and cruel that we can't justify it. So let that inform, your way of thinking about the world. The death penalty. This is the headline that you saw. The arguments against, and I've seen more headlines about it since Sunday. The arguments against the death penalty are numerous and well known. The church has rightly called attention to several of these, such as the possibility of juridical error and the use made of such punishment by totalitarian or dictatorial regimes as a means of suppressing political dissidents, oppressing religious and cultural minorities, all victims whom the legislation of those regimes consider delinquents. All Christians and people of goodwill, which they called for not only for the abolition of the death penalty, legal or illegal, in all its forms, but also to work for the improvements of prison conditions out of respect for community persons deprived of their freedom. I think people read this, and they were like, oh my gosh, the Pope is changing church teaching to say that the death penalty is not okay. The death penalty has never been okay. Like, he's not changing church teaching. I don't know why people are freaking out about this. And Pope Francis, like, he goes on to say that. Like, he cites, the earliest document he cites is from the 3rd century AD. So at least for the last 1700 or 1800 years, Christians and Catholics have been like, yeah, we really shouldn't use the death penalty. Augustine says it. Yeah, I don't know. Rejection of the death penalty is a radical display of love, like the love that Christ calls us to. And this is why. I thought this was a really great point. Let us keep in mind that not even a murderer loses his personal dignity. And God himself pledges to guarantee this. Like, it's not just about, like, we shouldn't kill people. It's like, no, even though he did that thing, even though he's a terrible person, he still has the dignity that God gave him. The firm rejection of the death penalty shows to what extent it is possible to recognize the inalienable dignity of a human being and to accept that he or she has a place in this universe. If I do not deny the dignity if I do not deny that dignity to the worst of criminals, I will not deny it to anyone. I will give everyone the possibility of sharing this kind of me, despite our differences. If I can love a terrible murderer enough to say that he doesn't deserve to die, he deserves to be treated humanely, I can love anyone. You know, it's a challenge for us to push ourselves beyond what we thought was possible, because it is only possible with God. I thought that was exciting. Okay, I'm wrapping it up. The last section is kind of short, and I didn't have to do this up for a time. And he's talking about religion and what religions do for the world. So, he condemns all forms of religious violence explicitly. He appeals to his discussion of the Grand Imam of Egypt to demonstrate the point that religions can work together for common good, even when they disagree explicitly. The effort to seek God with a sincere heart, provided it is never solely by ideological or self-serving aims, helps us recognize one another as traveling companions, truly brothers and sisters. We are convinced that when, in the name of an ideology, there is an attempt to remove God from society, that society ends up with broken idols. Very soon, men and women lose their way, their dignity is trampled, and their rights violated. We need religion. Like, religion is not an ideology. Religion should motivate us to love other people, and we should be able to agree on that with people who love other religions. So that's sort of where I'm concluding it. That's all I got. Yeah. Pope Francis, that's what he's talking about. Like, this document was very impressive. I was very impressed by it. I read some of his other stuff, and not that it's not great. Like this is a really good one too. This is you wrote this directed at young people, actually, after the synod for young people that they had last year. But like, it's a little more simplistic. It's a little more like for people who don't know what a reductive human anthropology is and stuff like that, you know. And I think it was criticized for that reason. But this document, it's academic, it's balanced, it's subtle. He's like making references to other things, and he's not even calling them out. And it's passionate. Like, he really gets right to the heart of things. And he says things, and I'm like, wow, I feel that way, but I wouldn't have known how to say it, you know? This is awesome. Pope Francis is a man of prayer. Like, he's formed in the Jesuit spirituality, you know, which, you know, maybe is a hot take in 2020, but, like, the Jesuit spirituality, the Ignatian spirituality is all about the discernment of spirits, which, according to the Jesuit fathers, is the most difficult spiritual gift to cultivate. The Holy Father was formed in this spirituality. He's a man of deep prayer and deep contemplation, and he knows what's going on. And it's our responsibility, like as members of his flock, to pay attention to where he's leading us and try to walk with him. So, that's all I got. Questions? curiosities about the document? Mike?
Where can you read the whole thing? Like, is it available online somewhere?
Yeah, if you Google Pope Francis' new encyclical, then the Vatican website is the first thing that comes up now. It's not Father James Martin anymore. Yeah, it's just online screen.
Okay, cool.
Vatican website, mobile edition.
Yeah, the Vatican website has pretty much everything that popes have written in for a while.
Yeah, and it's great. It's got links to everything.
It's all free and translated because he read it in English.
Yeah.
Do you know when he started writing it? If there was a certain, that was like the initial inspiration for it?
I think that his meeting with the Grand Imam was the inspiration for it. I don't know exactly when that was. I can look it up, but I know that it was definitely he started writing it before COVID started, and I know that because he has a couple sections where he explicitly addresses COVID, and he says things like, "When I started writing this, I couldn't have imagined what was going to happen, you know. But now that it's happened, here's what I think about it." And it's really interesting. Let me see if I can- It looks like they met in February, so I don't know. Maybe he was already thinking of it. Father?
I was just going to note that when he says, "I'm not thinking this over," this isn't new. So, for example, the death penalty, John Paul II's encyclical Evangelii Vitae, said that abortion, addressed abortion, the death penalty, euthanasia, and also he talks about employment and not just for welfare programs. Likewise, Pope John Paul II is in on that too. So again, Francis is carried on in that line.
Totally. Yeah, he quotes, the person he quotes most is himself, but after himself, it's mostly other popes.
Just another comment that I was reading some of his travels. He was to Hiroshima or Nagasaki earlier, if not this year, last year, I forget when it was. So when he writes about that, he was there for the commemoration of the events of the use of nuclear weapons.
That's true.
So that was very much on his heart.
Yeah. Yeah. Again, I encourage you to go find it and just kind of this document and look through it, look through the references it makes, because I didn't include most of them. Like most of those quotes that I gave you were in part or in whole actually quotes from something else, and you can go read the entirety of that. Okay, well, it's 8:25 according to that clock, so shall we call it? Shall we pray it out?
Yeah.
Okay, then I'm going to read, he has another, he has a second prayer.
You were watching?
Bono was too.
Would you like me to stop it or continue it? Do you care?
I'll find out and then you can stop. Okay. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit, amen. O God, Trinity of love, from the profound communion of your divine life, pour out upon us a torrent of fraternal love. Grant us the love reflected in the actions of Jesus, in his family of Nazareth, and in the early Christian community. Grant that we Christians may live the gospel, discovering Christ in each human being, recognizing him crucified in the sufferings of the abandoned, and forgetting and forgotten the abandoned and forgotten of our world, and risen in each brother or sister who makes a new start. Come, Holy Spirit, show us your beauty, reflected in all the peoples of the earth, so that we may discover anew that all are important and all are necessary, different faces of the one humanity that God so loves.